I was sent by the Vatican to inspect a secret facility where every rule must be obeyed. But there's one room no one dares to look at. Room 12C. I only glanced once. Just once. And from that moment, everything began to twist. Time, space, even me. Now, I'm not sure. I'm still human.
I stepped through the steel doors of the facility with a sense of cautious optimism that quickly gave way to an oppressive chill. The air smelled sterile, a biting antiseptic tang that clawed at my throat. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale, unnatural glow that seemed to suck the warmth from the world. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the distant hum of unseen machinery. I adjusted the thin, black tie that felt heavier with each passing second. At the reception desk, a woman with a tightly wound bun regarded me with quick, darting eyes. Her pale blue uniform was impeccable, but there was a tremor in her voice when she spoke. "Welcome to the facility, compliance officer. Mr. Halvorsen will see you now. Please follow the corridor to your left." I nodded, swallowing my unease as I moved down the long, sterile hallway. The walls were a dull gray, punctuated by heavy metal doors, each marked with a code I didn't understand. The echo of my steps seemed too loud, reverberating off the cold surfaces. Mr. Halvorsen awaited me in a small, stark office. He was an older man with thinning silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through me. He handed me a thick manual bound in black leather, its cover embossed with an official seal. "This," he said, voice low and deliberate, "is your guide to the inspection process. Every rule is vital. Follow them precisely, especially the one about room 120. I flipped the manual open, scanning its dense pages filled with detailed instructions and warnings. One rule stood out in bold red letters: avoid all eye contact with room 120C. I glanced toward the hallway window beside us. Down the corridor, a door marked 120 stood faintly illuminated. There was a subtle shimmer behind the frosted glass, as if the shadows themselves moved beneath the light. A chill ran down my spine. The receptionist's earlier glance toward that door echoed in my mind. "It's not just a room," she had whispered, "and the rules are there for a reason." The manual felt heavier in my hands now, as if it carried the weight of unseen eyes watching my every move. The oppressive atmosphere of the facility settled deep in my bones. I knew at that moment that this would not be a routine inspection. Something was very wrong here. I closed the manual and looked up at Mr. Halvorsen. His faint smile held no warmth. "Remember," he said, "compliance is not just about following orders. It's about survival." As I left his office and stepped back into the labyrinthine corridors, the words echoed in my mind. The rules had begun, and so had the waiting. Ahead, the door to room 120 loomed silently, a dark promise behind its frosted glass. I forced my eyes away, clutching the manual tighter, and took my first step into the heart of the facility's mystery. The story of my arrival was just the beginning. The real test would be in the following days, if I could endure the rules without breaking them, and what horrors awaited if I failed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stepped into the facility's endless corridor, my footsteps muffled against the worn linoleum floor. The inspection manual felt heavier in my hands than it had moments before, its pages densely packed with instructions and warnings that seemed almost absurd in their detail. Yet the oppressive atmosphere made every word feel urgent, as if the manual itself was a lifeline in this labyrinth of cold steel and cold eyes. I moved carefully, eyes fixed on the numbered doors lining the hallway, each one identical, each one a gateway to the unknown. The hum of the ventilation system was a constant drone, punctuated by distant, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. I remembered the manual's stern admonition: never linger, never look directly into room 120C. That directive felt like a shadow trailing me, a silent command I was desperate to obey. At the first intersection, I encountered Ms. Harrington. She emerged from a side door, clipboard clutched tightly, her gaze sliding past me without meeting my eyes. Her voice was clipped, brisk. "Compliance officer," she said, nodding curtly, "first day. The manual is your guide. Follow it to the letter." I nodded, swallowing the lump of nervousness in my throat. "Yes, ma'am." She glanced around, lowering her voice. "Remember, this place doesn't like surprises. Watch the corridors, they shift." I frowned, unsure if it was a joke or a warning. She didn't elaborate, only gave a tight smile before turning away. Continuing my rounds, I tried to shake off the unease settling in my gut. But as I walked, I noticed something strange. A hallway that I had just passed moments before as a dead end now stretched forward, its walls seeming to breathe and pulse with an unnatural rhythm. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the corridor remained, its extension mocking my senses. The manual didn't mention shifting hallways, only strict routes and timings. I checked my watch. Time seemed to slow, then speed up, as if the facility manipulated not only space but time itself. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Around the next bend, Janitor Mike appeared, his eyes darting nervously beneath his furrowed brow. He nodded at me but didn't speak until I was close. "Don't look where you're not supposed to," he muttered, voice low. "Not even a glance at one to see. It's not just a room." I stiffened, recalling the manual's most ominous rule. "What do you mean?" He shook his head, eyes wide with fear. "You'll see soon enough. Just keep to the rules." As I resumed my inspection, the corridors seemed to warp subtly, doors shifting places when I wasn't looking. Staff moved with mechanical precision, their faces eerily blank, smiles forced. The whispers grew louder, the air heavier. I clutched the manual tighter, the pages suddenly alive under my fingers, as if the book itself pulsed with the facility's heartbeat. Every step forward was a step deeper into a nightmare of bureaucracy and impossible geometry. And all the while, Room 120 watched. With each passing moment, I realized this was no ordinary inspection. The rules were not just guidelines, they were survival. And I was only just beginning to understand the price of breaking them. The shifting labyrinth awaited, and I had no choice but to walk its twisting paths. My first full circuit was a test of endurance and concentration. The manual's voice was a constant murmur in my mind, instructing me to check the seals on the containment units, verify serial numbers etched faintly into the steel, and never, under any circumstance, pause longer than 5 seconds outside any door. Yet, every time I turned a corner, the layout seemed to rearrange itself. What was once a straight passage became a spiraling descent. Familiar walls dissolved into mirrors reflecting distorted versions of myself, each reflection more gaunt and anxious than the last. I began to question my own senses. Was the facility a living entity, breathing and reshaping itself around me? Or was I unraveling, caught in a bureaucratic trap designed to break my spirit? The staff offered no comfort. Ms. Harrington's clipped instructions echoed in my ears, but her eyes were always elsewhere, as though she was both part of the machinery and trapped within it. The janitor's warnings lingered like a ghost, and the other personnel moved like automatons, their smiles rehearsed, their greetings hollow. At one point, I stopped to check the manual's diagram, only to notice that the map of the facility was already outdated. The section I stood in was marked as a solid wall. I flipped pages, searching for a correction, a footnote, any sign that the shifting was accounted for, but found none. A sudden cold draft brushed past me. I turned sharply and caught a glimpse of a door labeled Hun 12C down a corridor that hadn't been there moments before. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to look away, recalling the manual's strict prohibition. I pressed onward, each rule a fragile thread holding back the tide of madness creeping through the walls. Yet, beneath the surface of this bureaucratic nightmare, a question gnawed at me. How long before the rules themselves become the trap? And when that moment came, would I be ready? The labyrinth held its breath, and so did I. I sat alone in the dim break room, the walls a dull institutional grey that seemed to absorb the weak fluorescent light above. The thick manual rested heavily in my lap, its pages worn and crinkled, as if it had been handled far more than any document should be. I flipped through the footnotes again, the small print blurring and shifting like the shadows crawling across the walls. The clock on the wall ticked, or rather, it seemed to. At times, its second hand jerked forward in a frantic leap. At others, it slowed to a sluggish crawl. I blinked hard, trying to steady my gaze, but the sensation persisted, a subtle warping of time that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The rules were becoming labyrinthine, each clause more convoluted than the last. The manual insisted on absolute obedience, yet the directives felt less like guidance and more like incantations, binding me tighter to the facility itself. A sudden knock at the door startled me. Senior Inspector Madsen stepped inside, his gaunt face shadowed by dim light. He barely smiled, his eyes sharp and unsettling behind thin wire-rimmed glasses. "You're redoing well," he said softly, voice low enough that I had to lean in. But the rules, they were not just rules, they were the only things keeping this place from swallowing you whole. I nodded, swallowing a lump in my throat, the gravity of his words sinking in. What happens if someone breaks them? Madsen's eyes darkened. "You don't want to find out." He left as silently as he came, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me with my spiraling thoughts. Later, as I made my rounds, the facility seemed to breathe around me. Walls that were straight the day before now curved subtly, hallways twisting in impossible angles. The air was thick with the metallic scent of machinery, and something else, something faint, but unmistakably wrong. When I approached room 120, the manual's warning echoed in my mind, avoid eye contact at all costs. But as I passed the frosted glass, a shadow flickered. A shape indistinct but undeniably there, moving just behind the glass. My heart hammered in my chest, the urge to look again clawing at me. I forced my eyes downward, forcing myself to abide by the rule. The corridor suddenly felt narrower, the ceiling closer. I shook my head, trying to clear the mounting dread. At the central control room, the monitors flickered erratically, displaying distorted views of the labyrinthine facility. One screen centered on room 120, emitting a faint, pulsing glow that seemed to throb in time with my heartbeat. The rules were no longer just written instructions, they were walls holding back a tide of chaos. And with every moment I obeyed, the weight of compliance grew heavier, pressing down on me like a vice. Yet the question gnawed, how long before the rules themselves became the prison? How long before the facility's shifting madness became impossible to resist? I was caught in a tightening spiral, trapped between fear and fascination, between obedience and the creeping desire to look just once more into the darkness behind room 12C. The manual's pages trembled in my hands, as if alive, whispering secrets I was not yet ready to hear. And somewhere in the shadows of this place, I felt the facility watching, waiting for me to falter. I had to hold on for now. But the weight of the rules pressed heavier than ever, and I feared the moment when I might break under their strain. The clock ticked on, indifferent to my dread, and room 120 waited. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over the sterile corridor. I clutched the inspection manual tightly in my hands, its pages worn and inscribed with rules so meticulous they felt almost absurd. Yet beneath the absurdity lay a palpable tension, an unspoken warning that the manual was no mere bureaucratic formality. It was a lifeline. I had spent the morning pacing the labyrinthine hallways of the facility, following each directive with painstaking care. The hallways, the doors, even the floor tiles seemed to have a rhythm, a pattern I was only beginning to grasp. But then I reached the door marked 1C. A simple door like the others, painted a dull grey, with a small, square window at eye level. The manual was explicit: avoid eye contact with room 120 under all circumstances. I had obeyed so far, turning my gaze away whenever I passed. But today, something different gnawed at me. A prickling at the base of my skull, a pull I could neither explain nor resist. I paused, heart hammering. The corridor was empty, save for the low hum of distant machinery. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. I glanced down at the manual, scanned the page again. Non-compliance results in spatial and temporal distortion. I swallowed hard and looked up. The window of room 120 stared back at me. For a heartbeat, our eyes met, if eyes could be said to exist behind that darkened glass. A flicker, a shadow, a glint of something not quite human. Then I blinked. The change was immediate. The corridor shuddered beneath my feet. The walls rippled, as if the very fabric of the building was made of living skin. The fluorescent lights stretched into elongated, sickly tendrils, pulsating with an eerie rhythm. I staggered, clutching the manual for support, but the pages fluttered wildly, as if caught in an invisible storm. I tried to turn, to flee, but the hallway twisted. Doors appeared where none had been moments before. Others vanished into thin air. The floor beneath me shifted, tilting like a ship caught in a tempest. The air grew thick with whispers, unintelligible but laden with menace. Compliance, a voice hissed, close to my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. Time fractured. The clocks mounted along the walls sped up and slowed down in erratic bursts. Their hands melted into distorted shapes, then snapped back, mocking my confusion. The manual slipped from my grasp, landing open on the floor, the ink bleeding like fresh wounds. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, or something resembling one, with features twisted and blurred, yet unmistakably Supervisor Jenkins. His eyes gleamed with a sinister light as he leaned in, voice warped into a chilling whisper. "You cannot undo what you have done. Follow the rules or be lost forever." Before I could respond, he vanished, swallowed by the shifting shadows. I was alone. Panic surged as I scrambled to my feet. The manual was my only anchor, yet its pages seemed to change before my eyes, rules multiplying, contradicting, becoming more labyrinthine. The facility was no longer a place of orderly inspection. It was a living nightmare, a maze designed to trap and torment. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. Every step forward was a battle against the twisting corridors and the relentless warping of time. Each rule I followed was a desperate attempt to reclaim control from the chaos I had unleashed with one forbidden glance. As I pressed onward, that question gnawed at me. What was room 120 hiding? Why was eye contact so perilous? And was there any hope of escape? Or was I doomed to wander this bureaucratic hellscape until compliance consumed me entirely? The manual offered no answers, only more rules, more contradictions, and the haunting reminder etched in bold on the latest page I turned: obedience is survival. And so I obeyed, trembling as the facility shifted around me, swallowing me deeper into its terrifying embrace. I remember the moment I realized the facility was no longer a place I could navigate with simple, methodical steps. I stood at a junction where the corridor's three identical, sterile passageways branched out before me, each twisting and folding with impossible geometry. It was as if the architect had designed a labyrinth not just of walls but of space itself, bending and warping under some unseen force. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I blinked hard, trying to steady my vision, but the corridors seemed to ripple, elongate, then snap back as though reality itself were elastic. My pulse quickened. I felt the first prickles of panic tickle down my spine. I glanced down at the inspection manual clutched in my hand, the pages dog-eared and worn from constant reference. The text that once seemed so clear and unambiguous now felt slippery, the letters shifting and blurring with every glance. Instructions that had been my lifeline were fragmenting before me, like shards of shattered glass reflecting a fractured reality. Determined to regain control, I forced myself to turn left, stepping into a narrow hallway lined with frosted glass doors. The muffled sounds beyond each door, a whispered conversation, a soft shuffle, the faint clink of metal were unsettlingly close yet frustratingly indistinct. Behind one door, I thought I heard my name whispered. but when I leaned closer, the sound dissolved into silence. Time itself seemed to rebel. I reached a wall-mounted clock, expecting to find the steady, reassuring tick-tock that had accompanied every step of my inspection so far. Instead, I saw the hand spinning erratically forward, backward, then pausing mid-second. The ticking warped from slow and deliberate to frantic and staccato, echoing around the stark walls in a maddening rhythm. My head swam as I tried to focus, the seconds stretching and shrinking like a rubber band snapping unpredictably. I stumbled back, clutching the manual tighter, desperate to find a rule or a passage that could anchor me. But the words dissolved, the ink bleeding and swirling as though the manual itself were alive and resisting my scrutiny. My breath came fast and shallow as confusion tightened its grip. Was I losing my mind, or was the facility itself a living entity, twisting and manipulating time and space to trap me? Voices flickered on the edge of perception, whispers that seemed to emanate from behind the walls, from room 112 especially. I forced my eyes away, remembering the cardinal rule, no eye contact with 20C. But the urge to look grew stronger with every distorted heartbeat. Each step I took was met with a new impossibility. Staircases ended abruptly, looping back into the same hallway. Doors led not to rooms, but to endless voids or mirrored duplicates of the same corridor. The manual's instructions, once a clear guide, became a maddening riddle, contradicting themselves and offering no respite. I tried to anchor myself with the routine inspections, checking equipment, verifying logs, but each task felt increasingly surreal. The fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that grated on my nerves, and the sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with something metallic and acrid, like burnt circuitry. Shadows moved where there should be none, and the facility seemed to watch me with an unblinking, inhuman patience. In moments of clarity, I questioned everything: the purpose of the manual, the reality of the facility, even my own existence. Was I merely a cog in an unfathomable machine, punished and reshaped for breaking the rules? Or was the manual itself a trap, designed to ensnare the unwary? My attempts to recalibrate my path only led me deeper into the maze. I found myself back at the junction, the three corridors twisting and folding like an embius strip, mocking my efforts to impose order. The flickering lights overhead cast grotesque, shifting shadows that danced on the walls, their movement synchronized with the erratic ticking of the clock. I felt the weight of the rules pressing down on me, each one a chain tightening around my sanity. The manual demanded absolute compliance, yet its own instructions seemed unreliable, a cruel paradox that left me lost and vulnerable. And through it all, the echo of whispers grew louder, the unseen presence behind the walls intensifying. The facility was alive, breathing, shifting, judging, and I was trapped within its ever-changing nightmare. I forced myself to take one step forward, clutching the manual as if it were a lifeline. But deep down, a gnawing fear took root, that no matter how hard I tried, compliance might no longer be enough to keep me safe. The corridors twisted once more, folding into themselves. The hands on the clock spun again, faster this time, while the whispers crescendoed into a cacophony of voices, just beyond understanding. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat as the facility's impossible architecture closed in around me. I was lost, and worse, I was alone. But the manual still demanded obedience, so I marched forward into the shifting abyss, chasing rules that might no longer exist. The nightmare was only beginning. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was a constant, unchanging drone that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. But tonight, beneath that familiar hum, there was something else, a whisper, a faint susurration that slipped in and out through the cracks in the walls. I stopped mid-step, the worn soles of my shoes silent against the cold linoleum floor as I pressed my ear against the chipped paint of the corridor wall. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. The manual warned about the effects of prolonged exposure to the facility's atmosphere, hallucinations, temporal disorientation, paranoia. But the whispers were real. They tangled with the fluorescent buzz, weaving through the sterile silence like breath against skin. "Do you hear them?" I whispered to myself, voice barely audible. No answer, only the whispers, faint but persistent, like distant echoes trapped inside the concrete. They seemed to murmur in a language just beyond comprehension, syllables curling and twisting in my ears. I staggered back, the manual slipping from my grasp. The pages fluttered open, revealing footnotes. I had previously overlooked cryptic annotations, hinting at something beneath the facility's surface. Forbidden knowledge. Punishment. Sentence. I stuffed the manual into my satchel and moved cautiously down the hall, each step heavier than the last. The walls themselves felt alive, almost breathing, expanding and contracting with a rhythm I could neither see nor fully understand. My eyes kept darting toward room 120, that forbidden chamber whose door was always closed, always silent. The manual's stern warning echoed in my mind, avoid eye contact with room 120 at all costs. But how could I avoid noticing it? The room was a vortex of dread in the center of the labyrinthine corridors. As I passed, the door seemed to pulse, a faint glow seeping from its edges, accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible vibration. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the walls themselves were speaking directly to me, imploring, accusing. I reached my small office, the cramped space cluttered with paperwork and the ever-present manual. The harsh fluorescent light flickered overhead as I sat and pulled the book onto my lap. My fingers trembled as I traced the faded text, seeking answers in the footnotes penned in an unfamiliar handwriting. They spoke of the facility as a living entity, a construct that punished those who strayed from its strict protocols. Compliance was survival, disobedience oblivion. The voices behind the walls seemed to seep into my thoughts, their presence suffocating and relentless. I could no longer tell if they were external or internal, if the paranoia was real or a symptom of the place. Time warped around me, minutes stretched into hours, yet the clocks in the hallways spun erratically, their hands twitching backwards and forwards like the facility itself was unspooling. An abrupt knock on the door startled me. Security guard Jensen stepped in, his expression unreadable beneath the harsh shadows of the corridor light. "You all right, officer?" he asked, voice low but firm. "I hear voices," I confessed, ashamed and trembling, behind the walls from room 120C. Jensen's eyes narrowed. "You were not the first," he said quietly. "But you were the first to admit it. Keep your head down and follow the manual. That's all we can do." His words offered little comfort. I was descending into a madness I could neither escape nor understand, tethered to a rule book that grew more surreal with every page. The whispers followed me, trailing like ghosts, their meaning just out of reach. Later, I found myself once again before room 1C. The silence was oppressive, thick enough to suffocate. I dared a glance, a flicker of eye contact before I forced myself away. The room seemed to recoil, and the facility shuddered in response. The voices crescendoed into a cacophony of lament and fury, shaking the walls and rattling my very soul. I stumbled back, clutching the manual to my chest, the words blurring as tears pricked my eyes. The facility was alive, watching, judging, punishing. And I was trapped within its shifting maze, a prisoner of rules that bent not just space and time but reality itself. The whispers promised secrets, but at what cost? The manual was no longer a guide but a shackle, binding me to a fate I could not yet comprehend. Compliance was no longer a choice, it was a desperate, fragile lifeline. And somewhere, behind the walls, the voices waited. The manual lay open on the scarred metal table, its pages flickering under the unreliable glow of the overhead fluorescence. I could feel the weight of the words pressing down on me, each sentence crawling and twisting like the tendrils of some living thing. I had read and reread the inspection manual countless times since breaking protocol, but tonight, something was different. The footnotes, once obscure and innocuous, now whispered secrets I hadn't noticed before, cryptic annotations scrawled in a hand that seemed to shift and blur as I stared. I leaned closer, my breath shallow, tracing the fine print beneath the dense instructions that had governed my every step. The text spoke in riddles about the facility, a place not just of cold steel and sealed doors, but something alive, vigilant, and unforgiving. It was as if the manual itself was sentient, a guardian of rules that were less about order and more about survival. The structure is watchful, one footnote warned, and every breach is noted, punished in kind. A chill crept down my spine. The halls had already begun to distort around me since I had broken the cardinal rule, making eye contact with room 120C. At first, it was subtle, a corridor that stretched longer than it should, a door that led to nowhere. Now, the manual's warnings echoed in my mind, gnawing at my sanity. I closed the book and stood, pacing the narrow confines of my assigned quarters. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, their surfaces breathing in time with my own ragged heartbeat. My footsteps echoed back at me, warped and delayed, as though the facility itself was mocking my presence. This place was no longer just a building, it was a maze that shifted with my every misstep, a living nightmare wrapped in bureaucracy. Returning to the manual, I read aloud a passage, my voice trembling. Compliance is safety, but safety is a cage. The facility feeds on disorder but starves on submission. The words tasted bitter, twisting in my mouth, and as I spoke them, the shadows in the room deepened unnaturally. A faint whisper slithered through the walls, a chorus of voices, both accusing and beckoning. I clutched the manual tighter, my knuckles white, and tried to focus on the instructions. But the lines between the pages and the world around me began to blur. The impossible geometry of the hallways invaded my thoughts, fracturing my grasp on reality. Time itself seemed to fracture. Moments stretched and collapsed in on themselves. I caught glimpses of impossible spaces, stairways folding into themselves, doors that opened onto infinite darkness. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my hands were stained with ink from frantic notes and annotations. The manual had become an obsession, a lifeline and a torment. I scribbled warnings and reminders in the margins, trying to decode the facility's true nature. But with every revelation, the dread deepened. The manual was not just a guide, it was a warning, a contract with a place that demanded total obedience, but offered no mercy. I paused, staring at a footnote that had not been there before. Look not into 125s unless you wish to become part of the structure. The facility remembers. The facility punishes. The facility consumes. A sudden noise made me jump a low, guttural hum vibrating through the walls, like the pulse of a heartbeat not my own. I swallowed hard, the manual slipping from my grasp and fluttering open to a page I had not yet read. The letters seemed to crawl across the paper, forming words I could barely comprehend. Was this place alive? Was it watching me now, reading my every thought, judging my every act? And if so, what price would I pay for my defiance? The questions gnawed at me as I sank to the floor, clutching the manual like a talisman. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that my descent was not yet complete. The facility's secrets were unraveling before me, and with each page turned, I was slipping further into a labyrinth of madness from which there might be no escape. But the manual demanded compliance, and so I read on, knowing that the cost of ignorance might be far worse than the cost of obedience. The dawn never came. The facility's lights dimmed and flickered as I sat amidst the growing shadows, the manual's pages whispering their twisted truths. Time no longer followed a linear path, folding and unfolding like the walls around me. Every breath, every heartbeat, felt both eternal and fleeting. I could hear voices behind the walls, faint, mocking, and agonized. They were the echoes of those who had come before me, trapped between compliance and oblivion. Their warnings were etched into the fabric of the manual, hidden in cryptic footnotes and elusive annotations. The more I tried to understand, the deeper I was pulled into the facility's living nightmare. The manual was not just a book. It was a living entity, a conduit between the facility and its keepers. It demanded my obedience but offered no salvation. In its pages I found no comfort, only the relentless pressure of rules that twisted and warped with the shifting architecture. I was losing myself, but still I read. Still I obeyed, because the alternative was unthinkable, and somewhere behind the walls room 12C waited. I found myself once again standing before the cold, sealed door of room 12C, the place I had been warned against looking at, the place that now seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walls around me throbbed faintly, like a heartbeat in the concrete, the fluorescent lights flickering irregularly above, casting long, twisting shadows that crept along the floor like living things. The manual lay open in my trembling hands, its pages worn, the text seeming to shift and rewrite itself as I stared. Compliance was my only option, the only way to hope for escape or even sanity. Yet, the deeper I sank into the rules, the more I felt my sense of self dissolving, like ink bleeding into water. A sudden chill swept through the corridor, the air thickening until my breath came out in ragged clouds. The whispers began then, soft and indistinct, coming from behind the walls, from the very fabric of the facility itself. They spoke in tongues I could not understand, yet their meaning was clear. The place was alive, and it was watching me. My heart pounded, each beat echoing through the hollow chamber of my chest, as I forced my eyes away from the door, recalling the stern admonition, never make eye contact with room 20s. The distorted clock above swung wildly backward, its hands spinning like the wheels of a nightmare. Time itself seemed unraveled here, minutes stretched into hours, only to snap back in jagged shards. I clutched the manual tighter, the pages now filled with cryptic annotations that hinted at a terrible truth. The facility was a sentient entity, a prison of endless rules designed not to protect, but to trap. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, the facility supervisor, his gaunt frame flickering in the unstable light. His voice was low, a rasping whisper that scraped against my ears like fingernails on glass. "You must choose," he intoned, "compliance or oblivion. To obey fully is to surrender your identity, but to resist is to be consumed by the darkness beyond room 12C. I felt the weight of his words settle like a stone in my gut. The manual's rules were no longer mere instructions. They were chains binding me to this shifting labyrinth. Yet, the alternative, surrendering to the madness, promised an even darker fate. My mind reeled as the corridors around me began to twist and fold, walls bending impossibly, the floor rippling like a disturbed pond. With a trembling breath, I made my decision. I would obey, every line, every rule, no matter how absurd or confounding. The manual would be my salvation or my doom. As I recited the rules aloud, the facility's distortions slowed, the walls ceasing their unnatural movement. But a terrible price was exacted. I felt myself unraveling, my memories slipping away like sand through fingers. My reflection in the cracked glass beside me, a stranger's face. In that moment, the true nature of the inspection was revealed. It was not an investigation, but a transformation. A ritual of submission to an ancient bureaucracy that fed on obedience and erased individuality. Room 12 was not just a room, but a void, a nexus where broken inspectors were absorbed into the endless machinery of the facility. I stepped back, the manual now a weightless whisper in my hands. The door to room 112 remained closed, but I knew it was watching, waiting for the next soul to falter. Compliance was no salvation, it was an eternal sentence. And as the facility shadows closed in around me, I realized the only escape was oblivion itself. But still, a faint spark of defiance flickered within me. Perhaps somewhere in the endless rules and shifting walls, there was a way to break free. Or perhaps compliance was simply the first step towards something far worse. I took a step forward, the manual guiding my trembling hand. The inspection was not over, it was only beginning. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of sterile white walls and buzzing lights. My footsteps echoed hollowly, a steady rhythm against the silence that pressed in on all sides. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold metal, but beneath it lurked a subtle, decay-like undertone, as if the facility itself was breathing its last, or perhaps just awakening. With every page I turned in the manual, The words seemed less like instructions and more like incantations, spells to keep the darkness at bay. Yet the deeper I read, the more I understood that the darkness was not outside, but within the rules, within the facility, within myself. Time was no longer linear here. Minutes stretched and snapped, memories folded into dreams, and dreams bled into waking life. My reflection in the glass panel flickered, sometimes showing a gaunt, hollow-eyed man, other times a stranger whose eyes held infinite sadness. I tried to reach out to the staff, but they moved like ghosts, their faces blank, their voices hushed and mechanical. They seemed trapped in their own loops, endlessly running the same protocols, their eyes never meeting mine. The facility was a machine, and we were all its cogs, grinding endlessly toward an unknown end. The manual warned of the consequences of breaking the rules, but it was vague on what awaited those who obeyed fully. Now I understood obedience was not freedom. It was a slow erasure, a fading into the endless bureaucracy that consumed identity and will. Yet, even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, a single thought remained: to survive, I must keep following the rules. To survive, I must comply. To survive, I must endure the shifting madness and the watchful silence of room 12C. And so, I walk forward, the manual clutched tight, the rules my only shield against the abyss.